Hello and welcome. This is all about Ukraine. Latest news, war trends, and deep analytics from Ukraine to the whole world. Today we're going to talk about the energy crisis caused by the continuous Russian bomb shelling. Is the world really getting tired of supporting Ukraine? And which Russian fakes has made the whole planet laugh out loud? More details right now. The Russian Federation has not made a single progress at the front, so it is actively bombing Ukrainian infrastructure and mocking local residents. Emergency blackouts continue throughout the whole country. Ukrainians have to adapt quickly to new wartime conditions. And this, of course, has influenced heavily the life of every Ukrainian, businesses and educational processes.
During the 9 months of the full-scale war, Russian terrorists attacked Ukraine's energy facilities more than 90 times, the Prosecutor General's office reported.
The Russians destroyed everything and they are happy about it.
Hundreds of residents in Kiev queued with bottles after Russians' attacks knocked out water and power supplies on October the 31st. Energy facilities in Kiev, Kirovograd, Chernivtsi and Cherkasy regions were fired upon. In addition, in Kharkiv and Zaporizhia. On the eve of winter, Russia is trying to provoke an energy collapse in Ukraine.
The main goal now is to close the sky above the object of critical and energy infrastructure. If we receive enough air defense equipment to provide at least 19% protection against cruise missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles, then with a high probability the heating season will pass normally. If this is not done, there is a high probability that the united energy system of Ukraine will disintegrate into separate energy island after another massive attack. And then no one will be able to guarantee its functioning.
Ever since the times of the USSR, our country has been in a single energy system with Russia and Belarus. And we turned off just before the invasion, at midnight on February the 24th. And on March 16th, Ukraine joined the unified energy system of Europe. Before the full-scale war, 51% of electricity was produced by nuclear power plants, 36% by thermal power plants, 5% by hydroelectric power plants, and 8% by green generation. Currently, a third of Ukrainian power plants are under temporary occupation. One of them, the Luhansk station, is cut off from the Ukrainian power grid and operates in parallel with the Russian one. We don't know a lot of information about the energy supply of occupied settlements. About the territories controlled by Ukraine, where hostilities continue, the authorities urge people to live before the onset of frost, because there is a critical destruction of the infrastructure there. About the temporarily occupied energy facilities, Zaporizhia nuclear power plant attracts the most attention. Russian troops periodically shelling the station and the city of Energodar, provoking an environmental disaster. But Moscow blames Ukraine for shelling. Russia wants to connect the Zaporizhia NPP to its power system, but the Energoatom company considers this unlikely.
It's quite long process to do that, you know. So it's not easy. First, second, there is no preconditions for that at all. So it's no any work done for preparation of this process, and just to prepare for this transfer from one supplier to another, you will need about 3 years.
Zaporizhzhia station supplied electricity mainly to large industrial facilities that stopped working because of the war. Due to the invasion of Russia, electricity consumption in Ukraine decreased by 35%. In addition, the so-called fan power outages were introduced in the country. So if the Russian missiles don't reach their targets, there will be enough energy capacity to survive next winter.
And now let's talk about the European support of Ukraine with the Ukrainian diplomat and the ambassador of Ukraine to Austria in 2014-2021, Olexander Scherba. So, Alexander, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, nearly half of the energy infrastructure of Ukraine has been destroyed or severely damaged by the shelling. It's quite clear that the main aim of Russian terroristic action is to make a full blackout throughout the whole country. Do the Ukrainian authorities have a plan to build the so-called protection umbrellas for the energy infrastructure? What's your opinion?
Well, it's difficult to make plans amid war. People survive one day at a time, 1 week at a time, depending on where the enemy shells next and which energy object he will destroy next. I cannot speak for the authorities for sure, but it is my feeling and assumption that the contingency plan on our part is basically to repair whatever we can as fast as we can, as fast as we get supplied by our Western partners with necessary spare parts.
Yeah, but don't you think that prevention is the best recipe in this situation?
We cannot prevent Russia from shelling our objects. We can definitely protect our at least some of our energy objects as long as we have the necessary anti-aircraft equipment. And we are getting it. But unfortunately, the thing is with our Western partners that they give us what we need, but with some
schedule.
A bit belatedly, yeah.
Yeah, but this why I got another question. So we have already seen the positive prospects of Ramstein sessions. Do we have to expect the similar one in the energy system? Let's call it like an energy Ramstein.
Well, we have energy Ramstein since March or April, and since March, I think, when the European Union created a special fund to support Ukraine in the energy field that is operated by Energy Community in Vienna. The director of this fund was here, the Polish diplomat Artur Lorkowski. He was here 2 weeks ago. He had lots and lots of meetings on the governmental level. I do hope that the meetings were productive. I met with him. He was rather optimistic. He said the necessary money is finally given, supplied, donated to this fund. Just the question is once again to be fast enough to give whatever necessary, whatever Ukraine finds necessary.
Yes, to be just one step ahead is all we need right now to protect the energy system. Which Ukrainian region is the most vulnerable to the full shutdown right now?
Well, I cannot single out one region, but obviously the closer you are to the occupiers, the more vulnerable you are. And we see it in the news basically every night before noon. The day before yesterday it was Dnipro, yesterday it was Kryvyi Rih. I don't know who will be next, but usually it's One of the neighboring oblasts. So long we are holding up, of course, but it's getting more and more difficult. And it's quite obvious right now that Kiev is moving more and more to the focus of this terrorist country called Russia. They want the spirit of civilians, first of all, in the capital city down.
Yeah, that's totally true, because I live at the very center of Kiev. So do I have to move to the village and start collecting wood in face of the tough winter?
That's the same case with me. I also live in Kiev downtown, very close to all these, dangerous objects that could be the targets of the next attack. And of course, as all Kievites, I think about, what would be happening if there is this full blackout.
What are you gonna
live
do?
On the outskirts of Kiev, and they have a house with fireplace. So in the worst case scenario, I move to them.
Yeah, okay. So just right after the program, could you give me the address? If it's possible, we'll join you.
Very good.
Thank you for being with us today. That was Olexander Scherba, the Ukrainian diplomat, ambassador of Ukraine to Austria in 2014-2021. The Russian Federation has not advanced on the front, so it actively bombs Ukrainian infrastructure and abuses local residents. Emergency power outages continue throughout the whole country. How do people and business adapt to the new conditions of war? Let's see right now.
Everything is electric because it is convenient and safe. No one thought that such a situation would happen when the lights goes out and everything disappears.
Preparing for a difficult winter, Alexander made sure he had warm clothes, shoes, and devices that helped him cope in the dark.
The power bank is quite inexpensive. The phone can be charged 2 or 3 times. As long as I live in the city, I have never been in absolute darkness. I realized that I need a flashlight, because searching with a candle, for example medicine, is not at all convenient. I have a headlamp, and my hands are always free. It is good to have a thermometer at home to control the temperature in the room. Well, you have to take care of the food. Here I have a completely simple device, a gas burner for hiking. He feeds on such bowls, and this is enough to prepare food several times.
Due to frequent mass attacks by the Russians on our infrastructure, the country had to implement the so-called fan blackouts. Authorities urged people to limit the use of electrical appliances during peak hours.
We try to charge our phones and use the washing machine at night. We turn off electrical appliances from the sockets when we leave the home. Food is now heated in a microwave oven, except when we are in a hurry, and then on gas. By the way, it's even tastier.
Ukrainians are also preparing for long-term blackouts.
I bought a regular 50-liter gas cylinder. It's cheaper to buy one that has already been used. It cost me about 5,500 hryvnias. And children have to get used to studying in the conditions of stabilizing blackouts. If the light is off, we continue the lesson. If we go down to the shelter and there is no light, there are large lanterns.
But it is very difficult to operate a business in such conditions.
We don't even keep track of when the lights are turned off. We adapt and work like this. We have compiled a current menu and prepare what the conditions allow.
And having lunch or dinner by candlelight only adds to the atmosphere, guests say. Ukraine agreed on the supply of equipment for the restoration of energy infrastructure with the governments and companies of 12 countries. Among the equipment that Ukraine receives are almost 1,000 generators of various types, automatic switches, heat guns and others.
How long will it take to restore power grids in the territories near front line, and how locals are preparing for the upcoming winter? Do Ukrainians return to their liberated homes? Our journalist will tell you this next week. Large-scale Russian shelling may cause a new wave of refugees from Ukraine, first of all to Poland, which from the first days of the full-scale war offered us a friendly shoulder. But are our neighbors ready for a new mass influx of Ukrainians, and how can help us in preparing for a difficult winter? We will talk about this with a member of the European Parliament, Petras Auštrevičius. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure of mine.
So, is it clear for European leaders that in case Russia continues shelling Ukrainian infrastructure, the new massive wave of immigrants to the European Union is quietly guaranteed? And I'm not just talking about thousands, but millions of refugees.
Well, in fact, we're seeing the situation when after 250 days of the war of aggression against Ukraine, the Russian Federation continues to fire and to and to do everything possible in order to destroy countries' infrastructure and target civilians as much as possible. So, I mean, we have probably all the reasons to believe that this tendency will continue. So that's why, logically speaking, we have to prepare ourselves for the situation when probably more refugees from Ukraine, and it's completely understandable for me why, because with no electricity, with no even water supply, and with the harsh winter to come, people are looking for kind of a refuge, a safe refuge. So that's why a safe choice, I mean, to take a trip and to cross the border to Poland or whatever country in neighborhood, for me looks absolutely understandable. That's why the European Union, as well as all countries around, have to prepare to receive and to embrace Ukrainian refugees.
Thank you. Yeah, let's hope for the best. But still, some experts say that the upcoming winter will be really tough. But what about the Europe itself? Is there any, disappointment widely spread, and this disappointment is caused by the energy crisis?
Well, you are completely right. There is a certain level of uncertainty or kind of, tense awaiting for the winter to come. And the reasons are following, probably, I mean, increasing energy prices, inflation, certain, tense in economic developments. Some EU member states may face recession as far as this year already in the last quarter of 2022. So, I mean, there is a certain social and political uncertainty, but, let me to be a bit more optimistic and to take this view from, in any case, looking at a broader picture, understanding geopolitics and geoeconomics at large. So that's why I hope that in spite of this uncertainty, Europeans are ready and able to receive more refugees from Ukraine. I don't think we might see same number of Ukrainians as 6 or 7 million as we saw in the first half of this year, but 1 million or 2 should be seen as a possibility and probably our obligation, I mean, to provide those people with something much better than they have in their hometown or hometowns or country in general.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for your answers. That was Petras Auštrevičius, the member of the European Parliament, and we talked about, is the Europe itself ready to accept refugees from Ukraine in the upcoming tough winter. Thank you one more time. The right for freedom in our own independent country is given at a very high price. The war affected every single Ukrainian. This week, the Espreso TV channel mourned the loss of a colleague, the talented video editor Vasyl Yavorsky, who defended Ukraine from the first day of the war.
Look at the forest. Come to us.
This video was recorded by Vasyl Yavorsky in one of their hotspots shortly before his death. He did not lose his optimism and cheerfulness even during the war. He went to the front as a volunteer fighter, changing his comfortable place behind the console of the video editor of the Espreso TV channel to a raw trench.
I am proud that I was able to work together with Vasyl because he was firstly a wonderful person, very reliable and sincere. He was an excellent video editor of both TV projects and documentaries.
Together with journalist Ksenia Klim, Vasyl created several documentary projects about the heroism of Ukrainian defenders. And even when he took up arms himself, he collected materials for future films at the front.
I visited him many times on the front line, and we discussed plans all the time. Vasyl said that he had already collected a lot of materials, videos on his phone and GoPros. When there was an opportunity, he said we will do something outstanding when the war is over.
After the victory, Vasyl Yavorsky planned to return to work on television. But on October the 21st, he was killed during mortar fire. The 44-year-old hero is survived by his parents, wife and son.
The armed forces of Ukraine continue to actively counterattack on the temporarily occupied territories: Donetsk, Luhansk region, Zaporizhia, and Kherson region. In particular, in Kherson region, about 13% of the occupied territories have already been liberated from Russians. In some settlements, for example in Novokakhovka, the Russian army is equipping defensive fortifications directly next to civilian housing. See our review for more details right now.
Map of hostilities, October the 26th, November the 1st. In Swativ region, fighting is taking place along 80 kilometers long front line, and in Donetsk region, Russian occupying forces try to make breakthrough on new section of front. Kherson. On the one hand, the number of troops in the Kherson region has increased to 40 battalion tactical groups, of which about 25 are on the right bank of the Dnieper River. On the other hand, the Russian forces are trying to take everything they can do to the left bank of the Dnieper River. According to the Ukrainian Armed Forces General Staff, the other day the Russian enemy began moving artillery to the left bank. This means that they will defend the right bank mostly with human resources, and the artillery will be directed from the other bank of the Dnieper. It is for these reasons that Russian forces have been evicting people from their homes in the coastal zone for a week. Also, the Russian military announced that the 15-kilometer zone near the Dnieper River, which the enemy is preparing for defense by mining and digging in, must be freed from civilians. Ukraine's armed forces are currently preparing for a new phase of the offensive operation, meanwhile destroying the invading Russian forces' munition depots and military bases. Ukrainian artillery worked against the enemy in Hornostaivka, Mala Lepetiha, Hola Pristan and Oleshki. Given the long range and accuracy of HIMARS systems, Russian forces will not be able to hide in the coastal zone of the Dnieper River, as Ukraine's armed forces keep the entire territory bounded by the settlements of Skadovsk, Nizhny Sirogozhi, Mikhailivka, Tokmak under fire control.
See more details about the situation in other regions on our YouTube channel, so like, share, and subscribe. This is all about Ukraine, and let's talk about the grain export deal. Days after Russia suspended support for grain export through the Black Sea, it has agreed with Turkey to restart its participation in the agreement. Moscow accused Ukraine on Saturday of using a safety corridor for grain ships to attack its fleet in Crimea. However, the United Nations, Turkey and Ukraine itself continued sending ships even after Russia halted its support for the deal. Now, Russia's defense ministry says Kyiv has given written assurances not to use the route for military action. Meanwhile, Ukrainian journalist Vitaly Portnikov says that Putin has no other choice but to resume the grain deal.
Vladimir Putin has faced a difficult choice. Either he attacks peaceful ships transporting grain from Ukrainian ports to Turkish ones, and by the way faces serious obstruction from the international community and possible response from Turkey, which will be the guarantor of the transportation of this grain, or he simply accepts the fact that Russia announces that it is withdrawing from the grain agreement, but everyone can see that the participation of the Russian Federation in this grain agreement is not that necessary, and that Russia cannot reliably do anything real to stop the actions of this grain agreement.
So what else has occurred in the world in terms of war affairs? So we'll get to know from our foreign policy editor, Yuri Fizera. Yuri, good evening. It's really nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Volodymyr.
Well, I got a question. What is your personal feeling? Is the whole world is really getting tired and getting less enthusiastic in supporting Ukraine comparing to the early days since the full-scale Russian invasion?
Volodymyr, that's exactly what I wanted to talk in my part of Ukraine all about. You have to understand that from the very start of Russian aggression against Ukraine that started on February 24th this year, the world in general was shocked, and unfortunately some countries even did not believe we would be able to stand up to Russian army, but we did it thanks to the Ukrainian soldiers, thanks to the Ukrainian officers, and thanks to the Ukrainian people. At that time, in February, Western countries started to give us immense military, financial and humanitarian support, and we thank them for that. But the time runs fast, and Russian war still rages in Ukraine, and sometimes we even start having hearing that some Western countries are tired of helping us. Is it really true? That's what we'll try to figure out. And we'll start with the United States of America. The United States of America has committed almost $18 billion in security assistance to Ukraine since the war started on February 24th this year. And that's a huge sum. But there is a division inside the Republican Party of the United States of America. Some GOP members, including House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, say they would end or limit spending on the war if they take control of the House after November 8th's midterms. Others say Joe Biden's administration gives Ukraine money, quote, we don't have. But still, there are more people in the Republican Party who think quite opposite. For example, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said Washington has to do more to supply the tools Ukraine needs to thwart Russian aggression, including additional aid. Mr. McConnell said that if Republicans retake the Senate, their majority would focus on its oversight on ensuring timely delivery of needed weapons and greater allied assistance to Ukraine. And now we are joined by Hanna Hopko. She is a former member of Ukrainian Parliament and former head of the Committee on Foreign Affairs in Verkhovna Rada. Mrs. Hopko, thanks for joining us today.
It's my honor and pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
You know quite well what's happening in Washington right now. You've been there some time ago. And so my first question to you is as follows. Will we still have bipartisan support from the U.S. Congress after midterm elections?
So I would say that bipartisan support, if we look at the polls showing that more than 73% of the American population think that US should do more for Ukraine and the level of support should be even increased. So I think bipartisan support is key for Ukraine, and it will remain after midterm elections because it's important also for US, Ukraine winning the war, knowing I just came from Taiwan and Republic of Korea, and definitely victory of Ukraine is geopolitically important, and the actuality of Ukraine defeating Russia is even growing in globally. So it's about American leadership, it's about defeating authoritarian regimes, it's about success stories which US foreign policy needs after the failure of Afghanistan. And of course, defending Ukraine is a part of national interest of the US and their interest at the European continent.
What happens right now with support for Ukraine in the Republican Party? I mean, this division inside God's own party is mainly anti-Biden game, or there is something else?
Some of their rhetorics is just an election related. And before presidential election in 2016, remember, we also seen similar situation, and even Ukraine was dragged in to the domestic policy of US. So I think we have to wait and after election to continue our advocacy. Personally, I visited Washington, D.C. after the full-scale escalation, a genocide that Russia is committing against Ukraine already 3 times. And in December, also planning with the group of women, public civil society leaders to pay another visit to strengthen bipartisan support, to talk to folks in D.C., which are, how to say, they have different opinion on U.S. policy towards Russia. So key for us is to convince United States that Ukraine defeating Russia is important to defeat Russian imperialism, not just to see regime change in Russia. Because Russian opposition, or so-called opposition, they are very proactively trying to convince US, EU, and other world leaders that with the change of Putin, Russia will become a democratic state. But we want to say, remember in 1991, when Soviet Union was disintegrated, it was a defeat of communism, but not the defeat of colonialism. And this is why it's key to de-imperialize Russia, also to defend the right for self-determination of republics like Bashkortostan, Tatarstan, Kalmykia, and many others, like Chechnya did after the Soviet Union collapse, proclaimed independence. So because for Ukraine, NATO membership in the future, and I do hope that US will support Ukraine ambitions in the Vilnius summit, NATO summit next year, to join NATO. And this is one security guarantee. But defeating Russia and this defeat of the prison of nations, it's also a part of our security guarantees that the enemy will never attack us again.
He will never attack us again. We will not only de-imperialize Russia, but we will defeat it once and for all the time. Thank you, Mrs. Hopko. This was Hanna Hopko, a former member of Ukrainian Parliament. Well, I have to say that situation in Europe is even more complicated, since not all the European leaders do understand the real threat Russian invasion in Ukraine poses for Europe. But recently, the attitude of some of them has drastically drastically changed. For example, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz at the beginning of the war said that Berlin would not send us armor because they remember the lessons from World War II. But just listen to what he said last week.
Russia's vicious war of aggression is once again intensifying. The latest indiscriminate attacks, including the use of kamikaze drones against civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, mark a new low in Russian despicable effort to wipe Ukraine off the map. The abhorrent way of warfare only demonstrates one thing: Putin's Russia is desperate. The proud and brave nation of Ukraine will prevail. To ensure that it does prevail, together with all our friends and partners, we will resolutely continue to support Ukraine.
Oh,
So-
that's a total change.
Yep, the mood in Europe changes for the best, I would even say, for us. And together, of course, we will win.
Yeah, that's cool. But we talked about and discussed the situation and the way the United States supports Ukraine and the European Union. And what about the Israel? Because this country has always been, hesitating in what they should do, and they got elections. What's happening in this country?
Well, frankly speaking, Volodymyr, when talking about Israel, this country was a little bit distant from what's happening in Ukraine. Well, they said they support us, but their support was not that big enough for us. But they had parliament elections on Tuesday. Will they, this election, be able to change something, in the support they are giving to Ukraine? This and more in our digest.
Fifth time in 4 years, Israelis have made their choice. 3 candidates fought for the post of Prime Minister: incumbent Yair Lapid, Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz. Despite the previous government, which included parts belonging to different directories, united to overthrow Benjamin Netanyahu, it barely lasted for a year and a half. He left his post and the country with its worst eco-environment in years, a separate large budget deficit and high unemployment. In the summer, the polls showed that the economy is the only thing that most of Israel cares about.
In my opinion, it's already crosses the red line because it's the 5th time we're going to vote, and time after time, I feel like we're some kind of tangled in this way of politicians playing with all their cards that they have, and in the end, eventually, the people who got hurt from the most, it's us. And I feel like also the financial status of the country also got harmed.
Unfortunately, again, it's going to be exactly the same result: 60-60, maybe 61-59 to one of the blocks, but that's not a stable. That's not going to be a stable government. So, sadly, we're probably going to go into another one in a few months, 6 months to 9 months, and that's the situation now in Israel.
Israel's policy towards Ukraine has long been stagnant. The world criticized official Jerusalem for the lack of proper assistance to Ukraine until Iran transferred kamikaze drones to Russia. Only after that, Minister of Diaspora Affairs Nachman Shai made a publication calling to change the country's policies in this war. Local Israelis often say that Iran's core program builds on Russian developments and are also surprised by the inaction of the authorities. The official Tehran is also a threat for Israel. Despite this fact, the Ukrainian issue is almost absent in party election programs. Only Netanyahu says that if he becomes prime minister again, he will look at what can be done, but he also does not make specific promises. According to the Israeli media, for now the opponents couldn't get more support than Netanyahu. He will sit in the prime minister's chair one more time. According to estimates by a number of Israeli financial institutions, 5 elections in less than 4 years cost the treasury more than $4 billion. According to estimates by a number of Israeli financial institutions, 5 elections in less than 4 years cost the treasury more than $4 billion.
So, Waldemar, I hope after these parliament elections in Israel, Israel will turn closer to Ukraine, because in order to win this war, we need more help, and not even from the United States of America or Great Britain or Europe in general, but also from these parts of the world like Israel. But once, if you remember, I asked you a question about who's Putin, and you at that time answered
that Putin, he thinks that he's a solar system, but in fact, he's just a dwarf planet.
Yes, that's a good answer. But if you ask the same question to most of the European leaders, they will most likely answer he is a war criminal and he must be held to accountability for all the crimes he committed in Ukraine. But what does Putin think of himself? This is what he said just this week during one press conference.
After terror attack against Crimea Bridge, you said that in case there are more terror attacks, Russia will respond. Can we call today's massive strikes on Ukrainian territory an answer to recent events in Sevastopol? It is so, in part, but that's not all we could have done.
So Putin is a coward and he is a terrorist, and he admitted this. He wanted to play chicken with the world, but suddenly he became that chicken. Cowards always lose, and he will lose for sure.
Amen.
So back to you.
Amen. Thank you, Yuri, for your comprehensive review and your high journalistic standards. But we cannot say the same when we talk about the Russian propaganda machine and the work of Russian media. And now let's talk about the propaganda itself and how it works. My colleague Sofia prepared all about this, and she's ready to tell us more. Lies, fakes, twisting the facts and other products made by the Russian propaganda machine in the upcoming review made by my colleague Sofia. Sofia, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Hi, Volodymyr. Dirty bomb and combat mosquitoes. Russian authorities were left with no arguments explaining to Russians why their troops are losing on the battlefield. So Kremlin uses its traditional methods, lying and creating insane fakes.
According to the description, such a drone transports a container with a large number of mosquitoes, the carriers of infections, to a targeted area and releases them. While biting, mosquitoes infect people with pathogens of particularly dangerous diseases. The explanation directly emphasizes that an infected serviceman will be unable to perform the tasks assigned to them, concluding that the disease can be a more valuable military tool than the most modern weapons and military equipment.
So, according to Mr. Nebenzia, those terrifying mosquitoes somehow can determine specifically Russian soldiers and attack them so destructively they can no longer fight. Well, this is probably the valid reason of explaining Russian army losses, which reach 73,000 dead soldiers this week. Amid fresh Russian claims, the United Nations Security Council members stated there is no evidence of any biological weapon programs in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the permanent representative of Albania to the United Nations, Ferit Holja, has asked, how can a mosquito distinguish between Russians and Ukrainians?
We cannot be thrown and stay in the propaganda courtyard just because Russia has decided to talk to and listen to itself and misuse the Council, exporting a distorted reality. We heard again today a lot of accusations, including about different pathogens and deadly mosquitoes. I wonder how those mosquitoes would be able to distinguish between Russians and Ukrainians.
All Russian statements about biological weapons in Ukraine created by American laboratories are fabrication. The United States Biological Threat Reduction Program does exist. However, it collaborates with countries and partners to counter the threat of outbreaks of the world's most infectious diseases. And before 2014, it was in Russia as well.
The Russian Federation has repeatedly spread disinformation including wild claims involving dirty bombs, chemical weapons. How much more of this nonsense do we have to endure?
Colleagues, I'm going to keep my remarks short because, frankly, this meeting is a waste of everyone's time. Russia has called us here once again for the sole purpose of spreading disinformation.
Well, the reaction of the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, Andriy Yermak, can sum up Russia's agony.
Combat mosquitoes, dirty bombs. It is already too late to treat patients there. They should be placed in and isolated in the chamber called Russia.
Russian propaganda has also worked this week on undermining the trust of Ukraine's partners who supply the armed forces of Ukraine with weapons. According to the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation, weapons sent to Ukraine may have found their way back to Finland and have ended up in the hands of the criminal underground. This information lived a day and turned out to be fake. The Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine stated, Kremlin campaigners willingly provoke the creation of dangerous misinformations regarding the state of affairs in Ukraine.
From the very beginning of full-scale war, when weapons from the West just started coming, Russia talks about it. Even early in January, Kremlin propagandists said, if supply Ukraine with weapons, they will pop up somewhere on the black market. There is nothing new here, Finland or not Finland, it could be every other country.
And yes, about other countries. Great Britain has also become a target for Russian propaganda this week. Kremlin accused Ukraine of carrying out a massive drone attack on a Black Sea fleet in the Crimean port city of Sevastopol, damaging one warship. And not just only Ukraine, but Great Britain as well.
It is the British Special Services who have enormous experience in carrying out such sabotage, like with the Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 pipelines. So it is in the Bay of Sevastopol, and now the reason for London's participation in these terrorist attacks was the use of British technologies regarding underwater drones, and judging by the fragments that Russian specialists managed to collect, I am absolutely sure that this is an English production. This is a completely non-Ukrainian technology.
Damages of the fleet are a painful loss for Russians as it equals military opportunity loss. This attack might be a massive Russian provocation to block Ukraine grain export deal and replace Ukraine in global grain supplies, Espresso TV political reviewer Olga Leny says.
Mentioning Great Britain was a method of brightening the plot. Russians do not want to talk about Ukraine only. They say they are fighting not with Ukraine, but NATO and other countries. Earlier, they said Russia is fighting with the United States of America. But the thing is, at the G20 summit, Kremlin plans to talk to Biden, so it was not a perfect time to accuse the US of blowing something.
Besides creating fakes, Russian army has been shelling peaceful Ukrainian cities and towns, targeting energy infrastructure. In general, Kremlin army damaged 40% of power facilities, President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky says. Meanwhile, so-called Russian journalists are gloating. Will they want peace in Ukraine when they are left without electricity? And we say yes, not just peace, but victory. The victory of light over darkness, the victory of Ukraine over Russia, no matter what the allies are. Volodymyr, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sofia. That's right. Despite of the dark times, let's hope for the bright future. After Ukraine's victory over Russia, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, first of all plans to visit the deoccupied Crimea. He said that in an interview with Czech television.
Mr. President, what will be the first thing you will do after victory, after Peremoha?
After victory, I will go to Crimea. I really want to see.
See. And when will it be?
Not in winter, because on the sea, what to do on the sea in winter? I will go when it will be warmer.
So can we expect the Peremoha, the victory next summer? Do you believe?
I wish, I want. We'll have our victory.
So let's follow Mr. President, and despite of the tough winter, we are preparing quietly to the summer season in the occupied Crimea. I even bought some sun protection cream in the studio. So that was all about Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Like, share, and subscribe on our YouTube channel Espresso, all about Ukraine. More news during the week, find out there. See you next Friday. До побачення.